Pardon the interruption, I'm Chris Gehrz. Sam, the Hugs for Health Foundation has declared June 29th the Hug Holiday. How are you going to celebrate?
Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I'm Sam Mulberry. Chris, this is our second webisode. We're now into the course.
We're hitting our stride.
Yeah, and we thought we would start by kind of following up on what we did for our discussion out of the first webisode, which is sort of thinking about students' thoughts on online education. What's interesting, I think, is that the first time we taught this course, there wasn't as many students who had had a lot of experience with online taking online classes. Clearly, it seems like most of our students have.
That seems like, I'm trying to think if I had any who hadn't, but it makes some sense, right? The technology is only progressing. I mean, I'd say since we started, Bethel has done even more with the summer. J-Term has had a little bit more. And then I was struck a few people are taking courses other places at the same time, which is actually a kind of a different wrinkle on the larger challenges of online. If you've got clearly, there are different ways of doing online that vary by institution, even within the institution. So that was one thing that struck me, is a number of people commented that ours, seems fairly organized, which I think we've always heard is really key to. I mean, hopefully I'm glad that comes across, because if we've heard nothing else, you want a clear design, you want something predictable, you want to know exactly what to do, because the challenge that comes with it is you're kind of left off by yourself then.
And I was really pleased that students were very aware of that. That is the big thing. I mean, the other things had to do with locations people are at. I think that's a big thing. I know at least one person talked about spending time at a cabin where they're not going to have Wi-Fi. Yep. And I mean, one of the things that I did because of that is and actually because the museums, when we get to those, they're really big in terms of the file size on those. So even if you're streaming them, say you're on campus, I know some people are working grounds at Bethel this year, so if you're on campus, you could probably just stream those and they would be fine. But even so, I set them up so you can actually download the museums. There's a Mac and a PC version. They'll take a while to download. Some of those are almost a gig in size. But if you sort of set it overnight to download, wake up in the morning and there it is. So, or if you're going to be gone, you can download one. So you just have it on your computer. Yeah.
One other thing that's changed, it feels like we're a little bit more mobile device friendly this year. I mean, one issue we previously had was that the movies, the films, and the webisodes were on Kaltura, which was kind of the Moodle version of YouTube, and Bethel has since dropped that. So now it's actually on YouTube, which works, because previously you had a Flash issue, I think, with iOS, right?
It was just slower and weird, especially if students were in different countries. I mean, it'll work on a mobile device. Kaltura did, but it wasn't great. Okay. Now it'll be great.
Now it should be great. Is that also true? I mean, I guess students by this point have had their first museum, but if they have an experiment, can you do a museum on?
I don't believe so. I think you're going to run into issues with that. So, okay. Yeah.
I mean, I think the other thing we had probably talked about, but I was glad to see several of my students pick up on, is that this is not easy, right? Online is probably more flexible in certain ways, and hopefully we do as much as we can with that. But it is not like there are shortcuts. I mean, if anything, it probably is more work for more students. There's more reflection. There's more writing that goes with it. And so I'm glad that came across, because I don't want people taking this class because they think it's the easy way out to avoid what's otherwise a really difficult course. It's just a different kind of difficulty. Okay, question number 2, Sam. We're doing our second webisode here. The first one was kind of an orientation of online CWC. This is probably going to feel a little bit more like our typical format. So what are these going to do once we're actually in unit, not just setting up the course?
Right, and I think what we're going to be doing is we're going to be reviewing some content. Chris and I have taught this course for a long time, and we...
Not just the online.
No, I've taught CWC for a long time. So we sort of know when we hit certain topics, what are the questions students are likely to have. So we'll try to kind of steer into those a little bit. So we're going to do some discussions within this podcast or this webisode today.
Well, we certainly welcome your other questions.
Absolutely.
Too. We'll always try to remind you to email if you have something we haven't covered. Shoot us a note, and we'll try to address it.
Right, and we'll dive into some of the big kind of issues in terms of teasing out some differences and helping to think through some of those things. We'll definitely talk about those today. There'll usually be 2 webisodes per unit. So this is the first, then there'll be another before we get to the first exam. The second one tends to be even more focused on reviewing for that exam, both in terms of what the exam is going to look like, but also content. There'll be content reviews specifically. Another thing that we're going to do during these webisodes is really help you think about not only content, but also how do you go about organizing that content to prepare for the exams.
So especially these first 2 episodes, we want to spend some time thinking about how you prepare.
So I think that would lead it naturally into thinking about, on the exam, there's going to be one big essay question, right? So as students are going through these initial films and museums in the first unit, how would you recommend they prepare for the essay questions?
Sure. I mean, the essay is the one that we've left a little bit amorphous. So if you look in your study guide, instead of giving you the essay question, we give you usually 4, 5, 6 kind of very broad thematic questions. And hopefully what you'll pick up on is that you're going to see versions of those questions in like film or reading reflections, certainly in museums. Well, often there'll be a kind of a theme running through part of the museum at least. So one thing I would suggest to help prepare is go back over work you've done leading up to the exam, because it's very likely that a question we ask on the exam has already come up in some form before, and you should be able to do that. Like with museum worksheets, we've structured them as quizzes in Moodle, and if we set it right, and if we haven't, let us know. If we've set it right, you're able to go back and review, and you should get some feedback from us. So I think that's a good way to do it. I mean, past that, that's kind of up to you, and that's where you're going to have to figure out how you organize information well. And I think a really good thing is if you can find a way to do that so that it connects with how you're studying for vocab, for quotations, the other things you're doing.
I think one way that I would naturally do this is also to look at the vocab list and start to say, where do I find clusters of vocab? Where do they cluster around really significant events? Where do they cluster around geography? And where do they cluster around ideas, right? Or questions, so in the first couple films and museums you've looked at, there's lots of questions about justice and these type of things. So that feels like a potential essay question to me. So then you start to say, okay, where you find that cluster, that's a place to think about, well, there's a potential essay. How do I think about the relationships between these terms, these readings, things like that?
Yeah, I want to come back to that, but one final thought I'd say on essays is that one thing about these exams is they're a timed exam. You'll have 75 minutes, but it's an open book, open note. For a lot of this, you're going to be able to kind of search through your notes. Essays are a little different. I mean, I guess you could try to kind of guess what the question is going to be and maybe jot down some thoughts. I mean, that's the place where when you take the exam, make sure you're leaving yourself plenty of time. I mean, I think if we've noticed anything twice before is that on the first exam, people sometimes run out of time as they get to the essay. So kind of have a sense of how long it's going to take you to write like 4 good paragraphs, and maybe even do that first.
Or at least read the question first and then go take the test. So then part of your brain is spinning on that question.
So another thing that maybe we should highlight right off the bat would be that in vocabulary, and we go into more detail in the study guide about this, you've got 2 types of vocab. Most vocab terms we simply think of as like recognition. If you see a description in a matching question, you should recognize it. You should be able to put on a timeline on map. But then there are certain terms we pull out as mastery vocab as especially significant. So what's different about those terms, Sam, and how do you study for them?
Well, what's different is, along with knowing who or what the term is, when it is, and where it is, we want you to think about why that term is significant, why it's important. And a way to get at significance. Sometimes it's going to be obvious. You're going to be, okay, I can easily explain why this person or event is important. Sometimes you're going to look at those and say, I know what it is, but I'm struggling with how do I articulate significance. And I usually say there's 3 questions you can ask to the term to help you get at that. The first is, why was this term significant in its own time? Why was it important in its own time? Second, why is it important to us today? Because some of these terms are going to have relevance that play forward long beyond the actual time that person was alive or when this event happened. And the third one is, what does it have to do with Christianity? Because this is Christianity, Western culture, we're attaching a lot of these terms and ideas to the history of Christianity. So asking those questions to the terms can help you get at why is it significant. Doesn't mean every term you're going to be able to answer all 3 of those questions, but that if you're stuck, that's a good place to start.
Yeah, but our general rule of thumb is for any of these terms, you should be able to give us 2 separate reasons why they're significant for any of those ways for Christianity and or Western culture. And we'll give you some practice at that. That was actually one of the questions on your first museum worksheet. And generally, I would say most museum worksheets will have something like that. Be looking for these key figures as you go through the museum.
And we'll continue to give a lot of feedback whenever you write significances. That's a place where I want to write. I want to write to you because I want to help kind of round out some of those thoughts.
I mean, another way we'll review, honestly, is in these webisodes. Like, I think it'll probably play out really well in the games we do in the second segment. So today, as we talk about some big concepts, what I think we'll probably do in each of the pre-exam webisodes is do a kind of, we'll call it food chain. We'll rank like 5 or 6 people, and we'll try to make our best claims for significance. So that probably gives you some ideas too. The other different thing about these terms is we might have a question on the exam that asks you to like take a pair of these terms and explain what they have in common or how they're different, how they're causally connected with each other. So that might get at the clustering idea you talked about.
Exactly.
Before.
Yeah. So within those clusters, you think about those connections. Another way that we often talk with students about how to think about terms in this course is think about it like a web, right? If you start with, a term like Socrates, what other terms can you connect directly to Socrates? So like Plato, you can connect directly, and then from Plato you can get to Aristotle, from Aristotle you can get to Alexander, but you can also web them out in other directions as well. I think that's a really helpful way to think about how to organize these terms. And then you think about that little line that connects Plato and Socrates, right? That's the connection, right? So when you get a connection question, you're going to describe one term, describe the other, and then you're going to say, how are they related? Sometimes those relations are direct. Yeah. Sometimes they're people who disagreed with each other, or like you said, causally, right? Something happened and that set the stage for this other thing. And when we do connections, we're not going out of our way to try to be really tricky. No. We're picking things where there has been sort of direct connection talked about.
And on an exam, we would also give you some choice too. So maybe one just doesn't click anything. But I think one nice thing about doing this for the exam and in your studying is I think it's a little stickier in some ways. Whereas it's easy to see CWC as just this list of facts to memorize, right? And some people are really good at kind of cataloging all those pieces of information. If that's not you, this might help because it forces you to, jogs your memory about one because it's connected to another. It's a good exercise to do too, just maybe something like that webbing exercise, or like go through a set of vocab and see if you can map them out in front of you.
Or put them on a timeline. I mean, timeline is another version of that web, right? Because Chris and I are both historians, so there's a lot of power to story, right? So if you can think about what we're doing in CWC as one big story, you often can find the connections in there because, I know this thing came before because it has direct impact on these things that came after. So that's really just another version of that web. It depends kind of how linear of a thing. I'm a pretty linear thinker in terms of that, so that's really helpful. Other people, they get kind of, start to get worked up about centuries and dates, and then they lose the fact that, it's just a. So, Chris, as we're sort of rounding out this first segment of the webisode, what is our sort of discussion post question for this week?
Okay, and again, you'll get one of these each unit. So the way it'll work is the first webisode unit will set up a discussion board post. The second will be, again, more about exam review. So this week, you'll have until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock to write a good paragraph. So we're not going to give a word count, but I think what you did for the first discussion board was largely on the right kind of length, maybe a little bit longer. What we're going to think about is the theme Sam mentioned earlier, which is justice. It's really interesting early on, whether you're talking about Martin Luther King Jr. in 20th century AD America, or you're talking about Greeks of the 5th century BC, like Thucydides or Sophocles. You've got this concern with justice. How do we know whether a law is just or unjust? What do we do about it if we decide that's unjust? You've got Socrates as a very different kind of response to that. So what we want you to do is simply, having read through some of these, maybe seen some discussion in the films, which of those really stood out to you? Their idea of justice. Maybe you agree with it, maybe you disagree strongly with it. Or if you want to, maybe you can put a couple of them in conversation with each other. But this certainly has contemporary application. I think we all wrestle with the idea that we want, as Christians, just as Westerners, to have a more just society, but that's a difficult thing to do. So is there anything we can learn from these historical figures that might inform our contemporary? Okay, in segment 2, we like to play games here on CWC, the webisode, and a new game we're going to try this year is called Make the Case. So we like to do a lot of argumentation in this, and we'll try to do this
just like life, right? A lot of argumentation.
Just like it. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to give 3 kinds of debates here, and Sam and I are going to argue for one side versus the other of these debates, and we're going to ask you to vote. This, I hope, will be a recurring feature of every game on every episode. Is we'll put something up, a poll on Moodle, where you have to vote which of us won the game, and we'll maybe keep track of this.
We'll definitely keep track. I was thinking we should have some sort of ongoing competition here, like maybe the loser buys a burrito for the winner or something like that.
That sounds great. Okay, so how are we going to know we've got 3 of these cases to argue, but Sam, how will we possibly do this in a randomized fashion so that it's not rigged?
I'm glad you asked, Chris. I hold in my hand 6 envelopes. As a child of 4 can plainly see, these envelopes are hermetically sealed. They've been stored in a number 2 mayonnaise jar on the Funkin' Wagnall's back porch since noon today. No one knows what are in these envelopes.
That seems pretty foolproof.
All right. So what is our...
Write in, let us know if you understand what Sam was
that reference makes sense to you. You're an old soul. So what is our first question, Chris?
So our first question, Sam, is who was right, Plato or Aristotle? Now, I don't know if we narrowed this down anymore because this could take us in lots of different directions.
I'm excited to see where it goes.
Probably put a time limit on it.
Which envelope would you like?
I will take this one.
All right, you go first.
I will be Aristotle.
That leaves me with Plato.
Well, I think Plato chronologically comes first, so Sam, you go first, I believe.
All right. I think that Plato is right, especially I think for Christians. I think the impact that he has on Christianity is a really large impact, right? I think he's asking a lot of important questions about kind of what is permanent and what endures, right? I think those are at the core of what Plato's asking. And the answer that he finds in terms of how he finds truth is to say, the stuff of this world is not the permanent stuff. It's not the stuff that endures. Everything around us that seems very real, this table, right? Our physical bodies, right? These things are going to degrade and go away. So we shouldn't put too much focus on the things of this world. Instead, he says that real truth is found beyond this world, right? In the realm of pure idea, the realm of the forms. And that translates pretty easily into thinking about, Paul often sounds very, very Platonic, right? That he's going to say, again, we don't store up our treasures here on this earth, right? We don't focus on too much on the things of this earth, but there is an enduring truth beyond, right? And I think Plato is really an essential thinker in the Western tradition. I think he's an essential thinker for Christianity. I think he's somebody who's pre-Christian, right? He's 300, 400 years before Christ. But I think he's tapping into a kind of truth and asking the types of questions that really help set the stage for some of the answers that Christ and Christianity are going to bring.
Yeah, I hear that. I also feel like this is not cell phone-ness. This is a cell phone. My eyes can show this to me, and the paper that's sitting in front of me and the camera I'm looking into. I don't need some abstract sense of there's a form in an eternal pre-existing realm that tells. Yeah, I think that for the vast majority of questions we're going to ask, the answers lie in front of us, right? And our senses, our God-given senses, allow us to take in information, and then our minds, our intellects, allow us to catalog it and to remember it, and more importantly, to think critically about it, to analyze it, to compare it, to contrast. All the things we ask you to do in CWC are very Aristotelian in most respects. And even if I would grant you that there's some things like love or justice that are harder to see in this world, we should probably not go too far down that path, because Christianity does, as we'll see in a couple of days here, have within it the capacity for Gnosticism. The sense of, what's really important is what lies beyond this world. And this world, this physical and material world, this temporal world, is just a trap. It's a prison. And even our bodies are shells. And I think that's a really dangerous impulse historically for Christians. If they go too far down the Platonic path, they forget that God created everything and said it's very good, and it's certainly worthy of our study and our contemplation.
Well, allow me to retort.
We're allowed to do that.
I hear what you're saying, right? And I think what we're hitting on is one of these key tensions, right? Which is there's a sort of a scientific worldview. Aristotle's going to be a lot more scientific, right? He's the father of a lot of that. Mm-hmm. And I think what Plato's hitting up against, and you even touched on this in what you said, is that there are certain things that science, that empiricism doesn't get at. And it's not just that there are certain... And the danger in what you're saying is, let's not worry too much about those things. Yeah. And I would argue those are the most important things, right? Love, beauty, blessedness, right? These are the things that matter most, right? So to sort of cast them aside only because, it's hard for us to quantify that. It's hard for us to know that with our senses. So that stuff must not be that important. Plato would say, no, that's the important stuff. That's why you need to train your mind.
Well, but here's the problem. So Plato then would say, okay, justice is this ideal, right? But we want to live in a just world. We don't just want to dream about it.
You aspire to an ideal.
And he does. And so Plato writes the Republic, the ideal, most just society, which is entirely imaginary. It doesn't exist anywhere in this world. But people then try to make the Republic exist in this world. And guess what? Plato doesn't like democracy, and he actually thinks philosophers are kings, and the people who have come closest to living out the Republic have formed authoritarian societies that are profoundly unjust. So maybe I'm just compromising and being pragmatic here, but I'd rather try to live out as best we can in this world, and that takes us to the other readings we've got, which have to do with ethics and virtue. And here I think Aristotle has a lot of practical wisdom to give to us, which is that we need to be really concerned with how our character is formed. These kind of deeply embedded traits formed through habits and custom until they become unconscious responses that help us to live well in this world, to be, not just to think about justice, but to live justly, to live prudently.
Okay, student, and we need to move on to the next question. So students, as you vote, I want you to remember this, that Chris is saying that sometimes the ideas of Plato have been misused, and clearly science has never been misused.
Never, ever.
Right? We don't have atomic bombs and world wars and genocide, right? That hasn't happened.
Well, they were reading Plato, I think.
All right.
Okay, let's move on to question 2, or this is going to be an hour long.
What is question 2, Chris?
Question number 2. Wow, this will be a short one. Who is more significant to the development of Western culture, the Greeks or the Romans?
You want that one? All right. It's like Christmas.
Again, I think chronologically you can.
You can go first.
Oh, okay. Well, we haven't said
the founding of the city is what? Is 509?
Yeah, earlier. It's
7th
century, I think.
708.
Right? Okay. You're going to hear from Sam some idea like the Romans conquered the Greeks and basically swallowed all of their ideas. But here, I'll go and take the very practical side, which is that the Romans built institutions worthy of admiration. Our polity, our system of government, our constitution is much more Roman than it is Greek. We don't live in a democracy. We don't live in a kind of 21st century version of Athens. We live in a version of Rome. And the Roman Republic falls apart because it gets too big, which is a good warning for us that's going to run through Western history. But I think the Romans have this very kind of pragmatic idea of how to make a polity, a society function pretty well. Now, given the Greeks and the Romans do things badly with regard to women, to slaves, lots of other people, but for the most part, for their time, the Romans have this nice sense of checks and balances, of popular government, that I think is pretty worthy of admiration. I'll stop there because I know you have something to say.
And at the core of Roman society and that empire is a Hellenistic Greek culture. Right, because while the Romans do have this, in a sense, admirable, big, powerful, ordered empire, right? What the Greeks have is something more powerful, which is they create an empire of the mind, which endures far beyond the existence of, what's happening on the Peloponnesian peninsula, right? Mm-hmm. Right, that their ideas endure, right? That the spread of Greek culture, right? That it, as Tacitus says, Greek makes a slave of their savage subduer. So yes, the Greeks get conquered and Hellenized people get conquered, but Hellenization is the thing that keeps flowering, right? That this is at the core of Western culture. And I'm actually going to do you a favor and not talk about the misuse of sort of Roman grandeur as later people try to rebuild the Roman Empire in different ways. But in truth, I really think the significance, not only, we talk about Greek philosophy a lot, but I think even things like the works of Homer, right, are foundational to Western literature, right? And I would encourage students to. Homer's somebody I'm a big fan of. I would encourage students to read Homer and realize these are a lot more than just sort of war stories about people beating each other up. It's easy to reduce it to that, but at its core is a lot of insights about the human condition and tragedy and grace and slaughter, right? That this is part of the human condition as well, right? That we are tragic beings. I think the Greeks are tapped into all of that in really powerful ways. So even if we took the philosophers off the table, I think Greece is pretty important. But then we throw on the Greek philosophical tradition, and I think that's undeniable.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like the Romans have great poets. They don't write anything like the Aeneid or anything.
Please.
Okay. Sure. Now, okay, let me just grant all that. It would also go nowhere were it not for the Roman Empire. The Romans built institutions which start before their encounter with the Greeks, by the way. The Republic is not a Greek idea the Romans borrow. That's something they come up with. Their idea of law predates their encounter with the Greeks and shapes law in most societies to this day. But let's say, they were, this empire of the mind. Well, there's an actual empire that spread that empire of the mind. It's called the Roman Empire. And I don't want to defend everything about the Roman Empire, but its impact, the fact that we have a Western culture, for better or worse, is a legacy of the fact that there is a Roman Empire. And they're invested in starting institutions of politics and education and economics. And they also have a few good thinkers, too. Like, I'm going to claim someone like Augustine as a Roman thinker, an African Christian, but also a Roman thinker who's trying to help Christians then eventually think how to live well in the world without being of the world. Again, I guess this is my theme for this segment, is I want to be practical and pragmatic and effective. And I think often of what our former colleague Kevin Craig told us about the languages, right? Greek is this kind of language that has 20 different words.
It's a philosophical language.
It's a very philosophical language, which is lovely and mystical and wonderful, and it's why I would hate seminary, because I guess I'm more of a Latin kind of person, which is a language of command and governance and structure, and it says, here's exactly what you need to do, and it's why the results endure.
Okay, I'm going to give you a parting shot. I'm going to give you the last word on this one, but here's my parting shot on this.
So I don't get the last word.
No, my parting shot, and then you get the last word, right? Okay. So politics, law, order, right? These are necessary to sustain life. Good plumbing, right? Roads, the things the Romans
aqueducts,
do. But beauty, philosophy, art, this is what we stay alive for, Chris.
This squishy, soft sentimentalism.
Okay. I think I'm winning. All right, what's the third question?
Number 3. Who is the better role model? And I was going to say for Christians, doesn't have to go that way. Who's the better role model, Socrates or Judas Maccabee?
I'm fascinated to see who we get here.
I'm troubled by things I have to argue. Okay, I get Socrates.
Judah Maccabee.
You want me to go first?
Sure.
So earlier when we were talking about mastery vocab terms, Sam asked a series of questions. So people were significant in their own time, but also maybe significant to later times and later Christians. And here's Socrates. Socrates, without Socrates, you don't have the philosophical tradition that Sam has argued for, because not just that he has the ideas, because those really aren't so important, but that he is courageous, right? And he is principled. And he is willing to not just have the conversations that generate the ideas of a Plato or down the road an Aristotle, but to stand by and have the courage of his convictions. And to do so in a way that is profoundly inconvenient for him and is profoundly noble and virtuous. And so the second half of the argument here is that when early Christians start looking back for connections with this Greco-Roman world, they don't look to military heroes. They don't look to Alexander. They don't look to Julius Caesar. Socrates is one of their favorite Greeks because he's such a clearly virtuous character. So one of the earliest Christian martyrs, Polycarp, he essentially cribs from Socrates as he's giving his last remarks. Socrates, he's benefited from Athens. He can't deny it. And Polycarp says, Christ has been my life. I can't deny my Christ to save my life. So.
This is a tough one for me to argue, right? I feel like you drew the stronger card here. But here's what I want to say about
setting expectations.
That's right, exactly what I'm doing. Right. So we think of Judah Maccabee, right? It's always interesting to play sort of the counterfactual history game, like what if things had gone a different way, and it's an impossible game to really know, right? Mm-hmm. But you think about the role that Judah Maccabee plays, that the role that the Maccabean revolt plays, right? That there really is the sense that where does Judaism exist? It exists in Israel and Jerusalem. Like, that's where it exists. That's really the only place it exists. And it is threatened in a way where, if not for the Maccabean revolt, there is a distinct chance that Judaism ceases to exist in the 160s BC, right? Mm-hmm. And if Judaism ceases to exist, that's the root of the tree Christianity grows from, right? So I'm starting by making the case for the significance of Judah Maccabee, right? Sure. So what we see in him is someone who really decides that there is a moment of crisis where standing one's ground is absolutely necessary, right? Because it's not that there were potentially lots of other options, right? They were in the face of a force that was really seeking to eliminate if not eliminate them as people, which Antiochus was maybe willing to do, we don't know, but definitely sort of eliminate them as a culture, as a really an ethnic group even, and sort of absorb them into this Hellenistic culture I was just celebrating, right? So I mean, I think there's a degree to which I find it complicated, because what I want to do is I want to say, well, see, I'm going to help make your case. Right? Socrates also takes the peaceful route, right? He says, I'm going to accept this, and by accepting martyrdom, I'm going to make a statement which echoes through the ages, right?
Yeah,
and that is a hard thing to do personally, right? And it's hard for me to say, well, the military response is the right response, but it maybe was.
It maybe is, and I think it's very easy for people like us who are fairly privileged, who don't face oppression, to say, well, you should never, behave as violently as Mattathias and Judah Maccabee do. I will say, however, I think the more Christ-like response, the Socrates response, right? I mean, what?
Yes.
Just think about it.
I'm almost ceding this one to you.
I mean, think about the other significance you can maybe argue for Judah Maccabee is he does set up the idea of what Messiah looks like for first century, what we think of as first century AD Jews, and that's why so many are so disappointed by Jesus of Nazareth.
He sets up an example Christ overturns.
Exactly,
right.
And instead of having this idea of what you need to do to be God's covenant people is to take power over, Christ is a power under kind of figure. I mean, what really is going to ensure the success of this and establish the new covenant is the willingness to die. And this is discipleship, right? Is that you're going to have to bear your cross. And we'll find later Christians, whether the martyrs of the 2nd or 3rd century or like the Anabaptists of the 16th, that's what they're going to say. Authentic discipleship is willingness to die.
And we'll also see people who accept the Judah Maccabee view of what it means to be a person of faith. And those are complicated figures, right? And I think we're maybe tipping our hands a little bit here as we think about the history of Christianity. But I find Constantines and people like that to be more complicated people to wrestle with in terms of how do I think about that understanding of what it means to live out faith.
Okay, we'll give last word to Sam on that. So, students, remember you got a chance now to vote. Go to Moodle in the poll and enter in who you thought won, Sam or me.
And remember how well I did on the first two.
Well, and I was going to say, I mean, this is a totality. Remember, it's like chopped.
Well, they'll vote on each one, so it's like a 3-round match.
Right? Oh, that's how we're doing it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. So you're voting on each one, not the totality, like I just said. So ignore that. Okay, boys and girls, it's happy time. We're doing this for June 29th. Happy birthday to Bret McKenzie of Flight of the Conchords. He's 39. Sam, Bret and Jermaine are famously from New Zealand, not Australia. What's the greatest contribution to Western culture by someone from a former British dominion? So, if you're not a student of British imperial history, we're talking Canada, Newfoundland, we're talking New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, India. I looked it up. Technically, Sri Lanka, Malta, if you want to go really deep here, Sam. But who's the greatest contributor?
I want to start by saying Flight of the Conchords is great. If you have Amazon Prime, they're all on there. You need to go.
That's the lazy choice here, to say Flight of the Conchords.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. And I thought a lot about this. I thought about this a lot this morning, because part of me wanted to say, well, Chris, America was once part of the British Empire.
Not a dominion, though.
Okay. But that wasn't what I wanted to pick anyhow.
Yep.
And then I thought about so would Ireland not be part of that?
The Irish Free State technically was in the 20s, so you could do
because I wanted to say, I mean, my favorite.
Too?
Well, my favorite writer is James Joyce, and I think he has some of the great artistic contributions to the 20th century. But that's not who I want to pick either. I apologize that I'm going to be a little serious here, but I really thought, in terms of, especially I think of models going forward. I think about Gandhi and Mandela as people who, in terms of thinking about nonviolent resistance, which I think plays into what we were talking about with Judah Maccabee, right? And then Mandela and that's not just Mandela, but coming the reconciliation movement that comes out of the end of apartheid in South Africa. That, I mean, Gandhi is still too close to us in history, and Mandela is definitely too close to us in history to really understand, but. Like we live at a moment where we could really learn from these things and take these forward into and probably need to take these forward in lots of other areas of life. So I mean, a lot of the things I thought about were sort of things related to post-colonial. I mean, whether you're talking about Joyce responding to the complicated relationship between the Irish and the British artistically, or you're talking about Gandhi and Mandela working in a post-colonial context.
Yeah, and having argued earlier for the glories of Roman Empire, let me say how glad I am you picked two anti-imperialists, post-colonialists. I was going to say Jamaica's not a dominion, but I would have said Bob Marley is maybe the great contribution. But
there you go. Chris, happy anniversary. Apple Computer. On this day in 1975, Steve Wozniak tested the first prototype of the Apple I, and 32 years later, the first iPhone was released. Chris, why are you so unconditionally and irrationally in love with Apple and their products?
I have, with the exception of 3 years in graduate school where I had no choice because of my budget but to buy a Gateway and suffer through Windows, I've always used Apple. My dad bought an Apple IIe. We drove down to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, or La Crosse, one of those two, and bought a IIe. for years, I argued and argued to get a Mac computer, and we finally got a Mac SE that my dad uses to this day, actually. So I mean, it's almost nostalgia at this, which is weird because Mac and Apple have always been like the cutting edge, but to me, it's actually like deeply embedded in history, and so those are just childhood affections almost. I mean, I guess I go for the typical things you'd say. It's you don't have to be a computer scientist to use the operating system well, but I think deeper than that, I'm really intrigued by the importance of design to the 20th and 21st century, and I think others are starting to understand this, but especially with Jobs. But Apple like understood the importance of design. I mean, it's not enough just to have the best technical machine or the most sophisticated operating system, but like there's this kind of look to it, and it goes to
and that touches on even and this is Steve Jobs' language, but your relationship to that machine, right?
Like, I mean, and like Jobs, I think it's why, like as a humanist, kind of a historian and a person dedicated to liberal arts, I appreciate what they're trying to do is something at the intersection of the sciences and the arts, right? That it's computer science by itself is not sufficient. It also needs to intersect with literature and art, and so the fact that the look of it matters so much from the fact you have an icon, right? The fact it's just so congenial to writing to me, which is not necessarily how Windows always feels, even though I use Word all the time, unfortunately. Okay, number 3, happy trails to, this is a good name, Tullian Shavidjian, a grandson of Billy Graham, who resigned recently as pastor of a leading megachurch in Florida after admitting to an extramarital affair. So I don't want to take this too dark, so let me turn it back. So Sam, Tullian Shavidjian is named after Tertullian, whom students are going to encounter in a day or two here. Who is your favorite CWC namesake?
I liked this question a lot. I thought about saying Augustine, who's named after Caesar Augustus, because that's like an internal really one. But in fact, I think my favorite, because my kids are just getting into this, are Calvin and Hobbes, who are named after John Calvin and great. Thomas Hobbes. My kids are reading those comic strips a lot now. Bill Waterston, I think, stopped making them in in January of 96. But there's a lot of childhood nostalgia tied into that, and also they're very smart and interesting and thinking about sort of their views of human nature and philosophy. I think that's you could do a lot worse than that.
All right. Well, you won this segment, but not the second. So students, get in touch with us with your Make the Case votes. First of all, go to Moodle and take that poll. Any email questions following up on things we talked about, maybe questions you've had coming out of the Ancient World section of the first unit. Remember that you do have a discussion post that's due tomorrow by 10 a.m. on justice and just versus unjust laws. Anything else, Sam, that we need to...
Questions as we're preparing for the first exam.
Yeah, okay. So thanks for watching our second webisode. We'll be back soon with our third as we go through the early church. But that's it for today. Say goodnight, Stacy.
Good.